Welcome students to chapter 18, which is the first chapter in our look at the cardiovascular system. This chapter focuses on the heart part of that cardiovascular system. In this particular lecture, we're just going to really look at the anatomy of the heart, kind of talk about the chambers of the heart, the blood flow through the heart, and then also look at the microscopic anatomy of the cardiac muscle, and then in subsequent lectures and classes, we'll talk about kind of the physiology of the heart, how it works, and all the slightly more complicated stuff. So essentially what the heart is a pump. The heart is a muscle that keeps our blood moving through our body, but it's not just a single pump, it's actually two pumps in one. The right side of the heart receives blood from the body and then pumps it through what we call the pulmonary circuit, which is to the lungs, where it picks up oxygen from the environment and then returns that oxygenated blood back to the heart. And then the left side of the heart pumps the blood to what we call the systemic circuit, which is essentially all of our body's organs and tissues, so that they then have access to that nice newly oxygenated blood. The heart sits in the thoracic cavity, in particularly part of the thoracic cavity called the mediastinum, between ribs 2 and 5, kind of sandwiched between the two lungs here. The base of the heart is actually the top of the heart, where all of these blood vessels are. It kind of leans towards the right shoulder, whereas the apex of the heart, which is this point down here at the bottom, kind of leans towards the left hip. And in fact, the left lung is somewhat displaced because of the position of the heart. Because the heart is an incredibly vital organ, again, keeps our blood flowing through our body, delivering oxygen and nutrients, the heart has lots of kind of protective layers kind of surrounding it, beginning with what is known as the fibrous pericardium, which is really just a bunch of really fibrous, kind of tough connective tissue that surrounds all of the heart. And then just underneath that, we have our serous membranes. The serous membranes, two layers, the parietal layer that actually lines the pericardium and the pericardial cavity that kind of sits there, and then the visceral pericardium or the epicardium actually kind of clings to the heart itself, and then the space between the two is filled with this kind of very liquidy serous fluid that makes a nice little friction reduction because we've got the heart kind of shoved in between the two lungs. Just deep to the epicardium is the myocardium, the actual heart muscle itself, and then lining the chambers of the heart is the endocardium, a much more kind of areolar, fine connective tissue that kind of just lines those chambers. The myocardium itself exists in the heart as these bundles of spiral cardiac muscle. They are held and kind of locked together by something called the cardiac skeleton, which is this kind of lacing, kind of crisscrossy type web of connective tissue that helps anchor those cardiac muscle fibers. Also adds a little support to all these blood vessels at the base of the heart. They're pretty heavy, so they need a little extra support. The cardiac skeleton helps us with that as well. And then we want our heart to function as a unit. We want the heart to pump as a unit. It makes it more efficient. And one of the ways we do that is we kind of limit the way the electrical signals spread through the heart. And our cardiac skeleton helps us do that as well. Mammals like us have a 4-chambered heart, 2 receiving chambers, the atria, and then 2 kind of pumping chambers, the ventricles. There is muscle tissue separating both the ventricles and the atria, so you can see the interventricular septum here, and then underneath here where you currently see the pulmonary trunk, but underneath that would be the interatrial septum as well. I have a niece who has Down syndrome, and a very common feature for babies who are born with Down syndrome is little holes in their septa between the chambers of their heart. Luckily for my niece, hers are closing on their own and will not require surgery, but sometimes they will require surgery in order to kind of repair the holes in the septa so that the blood flows properly. So you can see here is the right atrium and the right ventricle, and the left atrium and the left ventricle. I also want to point out the various sulci that you see here. There are a lot of grooves in the heart. These are essentially grooves through which blood vessels travel. So you'll see blood vessels in the coronary sulcus here, and then also in this interventricular sulcus, both kind of anterior and posteriorly. I also want to point out the coronary sinus here. This is a big kind of loose blood vessel that collects blood from the heart. As I mentioned, the heart is basically just a muscle, so it has a lot of blood vessels that deliver blood to the heart muscle itself, and the coronary sinus helps collect some of that blood and actually return it to the heart in order for the heart to continue to keep it flowing through the system. So the atria, as I mentioned, are the chambers of the heart that receive blood from the body. They are quite small, chambered. They're very thin walls, and in fact they are so small that they are actually covered by these little kind of flaps of tissue called auricles, which help kind of increase the volume of blood that can be contained inside the atria. Most of the body of the heart is not the atrial chambers, but these ventricular chambers. So the right atrium, as part of the pulmonary circuit, receives blood from the body via the two vena cavae from the upper body, via the superior vena cava from the lower body, the inferior vena cava, and then the coronary sinus from the heart itself. They dump all that blood into the right atrium. And then the left atrium receives the blood from the lungs via 4 different pulmonary veins. 2 from the right and 2 from the left. So you can see here is the superior vena cava bringing blood to the heart from the upper body. Here's the inferior vena cava bringing blood from the lower body into the heart. You can see here is the right atrium covered by its little auricle flap. Here is the left atrium covered by its auricle flap. You can see here are the right pulmonary veins. Here are the left pulmonary veins. They are going to be what is bringing blood from the lungs to the left atrium. The ventricles are the pumping chambers of the heart. Again, they take up most of the volume of the heart. They have much thicker walls than the atria. You'll also see these kind of ridges of muscle on the walls called the trabeculae carneae. And you'll also see these 2 very large papillary muscles, which anchor what are called the chordae tendineae. And the chordae tendineae are essentially heart strings, if you've ever heard that before. They help anchor the flaps of the valves to these papillary muscles that will, when the papillary muscles contract, help hold the valves shut. So the right ventricle pumps the blood into the pulmonary trunk and then into the right and left pulmonary arteries, and the left ventricle pumps blood into the aorta in order for it to be distributed to the rest of the body. So you can see right ventricle over here, it's going to pump blood into the pulmonary artery, which then branches into the left pulmonary artery, going to the left lung, and the right pulmonary artery going to the right lung. The left ventricle is here. It's going to pump blood into the ascending aorta. Then we get into the aortic arch, and branching off of the aortic arch are the brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid artery, and the left subclavian artery, bringing blood to the upper body. And then the arch kind of folds over into the descending aorta, and that will then descend down the thoracic cavity into the abdominal cavity and eventually down the limbs. You can see here are the papillary muscles. This is the papillary muscle of the right ventricle. Here's the papillary muscle of the left ventricle. You can see here are these heart strings, these chordae tendineae, and then the trabeculae carneae, which are these kind of ridges of muscle here. So atria up here, ventricles down here. The other thing that we have to discuss in terms of heart anatomy are the valves of the heart. These are essentially just like flaps of tissue that help make sure that blood flows through the heart in a singular direction. We don't want blood to flow backwards ever. We always want it to flow kind of in a unidirectional fashion. And the heart valves are actually quite interesting in that they don't open and close like a door. They actually just open and close in response to the changes in pressure in the four chambers of the heart. There are four valves in two different sets. So there are two atrioventricular valves that separate the atria from the ventricles, and then two semilunar valves that separate the ventricles from the large blood vessels that attach to them. So the AV valves, since they connect the atria and the ventricles, will prevent the backflow of blood into the atria when the ventricles contract, right? The ventricles are going to contract. Going to increase the pressure in the ventricles, and if the valves weren't there, kind of shut like a door, then the blood would flow backwards into the atria, and we don't want that to happen. So again, two valves. The tricuspid valve is the right AV valve, separating the right atrium from the right ventricle, and the mitral or bicuspid valve is the left AV valve, separating the left atrium from the left ventricle. For the semilunar valves, same idea. We want to prevent the backflow of blood, this time into the ventricles. As the ventricles start to relax, the pressure in the ventricles decreases, and you would get this kind of like suction of blood back into the ventricles, except for the fact that the semilunar valves shut, and so blood continues to flow out of the heart and into the rest of the body. The aortic semilunar valve separates the left ventricle from the aorta, and the pulmonary semilunar valve separates the right ventricle from the pulmonary trunk. So all of the heart valves, with the exception of the left AV valve, have three cusps, essentially little flaps of tissue that, again, open or close depending on the pressure inside the atrium and pressure inside the ventricles. The left AV valve, the mitral valve, is the only one that is bicuspid, two cusps. The rest all have three cusps. So we've actually cut through the heart at an angle. And you can see here are the two AV valves, and here are the two semilunar valves. So the AV valves and the semilunar valves. And you can see they're essentially little thin flaps of tissue. So let's talk about the AV valves first. So essentially what we're looking at is blood returning to the heart, flowing into the atria. That pressure of the blood flowing in kind of opens the flaps of the valves. That allows the blood to continue to flow from the atria into the ventricles. Well, once the ventricles are filled with blood, they will start to contract and kind of squeeze, which increases the pressure inside the ventricles. That increase in pressure will shut those AV valves so that the blood does not flow backwards. The papillary muscles will then contract. That will tighten these chordae tendineae, and that is what keeps the AV valves shut. So the papillary muscles don't contract and pull on the chordae tendineae and open the valves. What they actually do is keep the valves shut. With the semilunar valves, what we're looking at is ejection of blood from the ventricles. As the ventricles eject the blood into the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, the pressure in the ventricles will start to decrease as the ventricles then relax. That initial ejection of blood forces the valves open, but then as the heart relaxes, we get a tiny, tiny little bit of blood flow kind of going back just a little bit, and then it gets caught in these cusps of the valve. That shuts the valve, prevents the blood from flowing backwards into the ventricles, and keeps the blood moving through the circuits. Since the heart is a blood-filled organ that has to pump the blood, it needs a lot of energy. In order to have a lot of energy, the heart muscle has to have a lot of blood delivery to it. And the blood doesn't diffuse out from the heart into the muscle. It actually has to be delivered to the heart, just like it's delivered to any other organ. But for the heart muscle to get blood, it has to be pumped by the heart out into the aorta and then delivered via some arteries. That delivery only occurs when the heart is relaxed, and since the left ventricle is the kind of largest part of the heart, it does receive most of the blood supply. Most of our coronary arteries have a lot of what we call anastomoses, which are essentially little junctions, connections between the blood vessels that allows lots of different kind of multiple routes in order for the blood to get out of the heart. Although the two biggest arteries are the two coronary arteries, right and left. And if you did have an occlusion, a blockage in those two coronary arteries, all of these anastomoses are really not enough to kind of compensate for that, and you would then need what they call a bypass. So if we look at the coronary arterial circulation, you can see coming off of the ascending aorta is the left coronary artery, which then branches into the circumflex artery that goes around the heart, and then the anterior interventricular artery, which comes down the interventricular sulcus. The right coronary artery then kind of wraps around the heart in the right direction, and branching off of that is the right marginal artery, as well as in the back, this posterior interventricular artery. And you can see here these little anastomoses, these little connections between the blood vessels, in this instance in the back of the heart. If we look at the venous circulation of the heart, in the front we've got the great cardiac vein. It's this large vein here. The small cardiac vein is here as well. We also have these anterior cardiac veins, and then the great cardiac vein, the small cardiac vein, and the middle cardiac vein all merge with that big coronary sinus that I mentioned earlier. The anterior cardiac veins do not do that. They dump their blood directly into the right atrium. So that is our coronary circulation: arterial delivery, venous drainage. The heart is the organ that pumps the blood, right? That's what we've been talking about here, is pumping the blood. The right part of the heart pumps through that pulmonary circuit. The left part of the heart pumps through that systemic circuit. But all the blood that comes into the heart on the right side and goes out to the lungs and then comes back to the left side and goes out to the body, it's all the same volume of blood. Even though the left ventricle is bigger, all the blood that is pumped by the right side of the heart and received by the right side of the heart is also received and pumped by the left side of the heart. However, there are differences in the circuits themselves. The pulmonary circuit, in terms of its length, is very, very short, right? So the heart sits right between the lungs, and the right side of the heart, the pulmonary circuit, is taking that blood to the lungs, which are essentially right next to the heart. So because of that lack of distance, that shortness, the pulmonary circuit is a very low pressure circuit. The right side of the heart does not have to pump as forcefully in order to get the blood to those really nearby lungs. However, the left side of the heart is quite long, the systemic circuit. Right? The left side of the heart has to pump the blood up to the brain, out to the fingers, down to the toes, through all of the different visceral organs in the abdominal cavity. And so there's a lot of length there, which creates a lot of friction, which means we have a lot of pressure. The left ventricle has to pump much harder with much more force in order to get the blood kind of moving against that higher pressure. And so that's reflected in the anatomy of the two ventricles. You can see that the wall of the left ventricle is significantly thicker than the wall of the right ventricle. And in fact, you can even feel the difference when you are holding a heart in your hands. If you kind of push your fingers up against the wall of the left ventricle versus the wall of the right ventricle, you will find that the right side is essentially softer and squishier than the left side. Much thicker left ventricle wall than right ventricle wall. Again, because the left ventricle wall has to work harder than the right ventricle. So let's talk about how blood flows through the heart to the pulmonary circuit and then back to the heart and out to the systemic circuit. So the blood is returned to the heart via the vena cava from the upper body into the superior vena cava, from the lower body into the inferior vena cava, and from the heart itself, from the coronary sinus. That blood is returned to the heart from the systemic circuit into the right atrium. From the right atrium, the blood flows past the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and then from the right ventricle we go past the semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk then branches into the right and left pulmonary arteries, which takes us to the lungs, where that oxygen poor blood becomes oxygen rich blood. We get our oxygenation occurring. Blood is returned to the heart via 4 pulmonary veins, 2 from the right lung and 2 from the left lung. But all of that blood gets returned to the heart to the left atrium. It flows past the mitral or bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. The left ventricle then contracts, pushes the blood past the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta, and then from the aorta all of the blood is then delivered to the systemic circuit and delivered to all of the organs of the body. This blood flow through the heart, through the pulmonary circuit, through the systemic circuit, and back is essentially heart anatomy in one question. So understanding how blood flows through the heart and through the circuits is incredibly important in terms of conceptual activities, in terms of learning the anatomy of the heart, because it encompasses kind of all of the stuff that we have been talking about thus far. Before we break with this lecture, we're going to briefly talk about the microscopic anatomy of the heart. So we're really talking about the microscopic anatomy of cardiac muscle. The heart is mostly just the cardiac muscle. So unlike skeletal muscle, which is kind of long and kind of straight, the cardiac muscle cells are really short and fat. You can see they interconnect a lot, they branch a lot, and they have these really important features called an intercalated disc. And that's what you see kind of here, connecting the cardiac muscle cells to each other. Like skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle is striated, so there are sarcomeres present in cardiac muscle. Those overlapping thin and thick filaments still exist in the cardiac muscle, just like they exist in skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle isn't quite as good as skeletal muscle as getting oxygen from different sources, getting energy from different sources. So cardiac muscle has a ton of very large mitochondria, and in fact, up to about 1/3 of the volume of a cardiac muscle cell might just be nothing but mitochondria. cardiac muscle is very, very heavily reliant on aerobic respiration. So it really does need a continuous blood flow and a continuous oxygen supply being kind of delivered to these mitochondria in order to make ATP, in order for the heart to keep pumping and to keep beating constantly. So let's talk about those intercalated discs just a little bit more detail, because they are so incredibly vital in terms of the functionality of the heart. So the intercalated disc is essentially a junction between the cell. It helps anchor those cardiac cells together, but it actually has two parts to it. It's not just an anchor. The desmosomes, which are kind of spot weld, kind of Velcro-y type junction, they prevent the heart muscles from separating. Again, heart muscles are constantly contracting and relaxing. They're under a lot of mechanical stress. We do not want the heart muscle cells to separate from each other. And so we'll see these kind of desmosomes, these little linker proteins, keeping the cells knit together. We also want the heart to function as what we call a functional syncytium, which is essentially a fancy word for a coordinated unit. You don't want the right side of the heart to contract and then the left side of the heart to contract. We want it to go all at once. And how we are able to do that is by electrically coupling the cardiac muscle cells that sit next to each other, so they can pass nutrients and ions and electrical signals from one cell to the other quite seamlessly. And we do so through the intercalated discs, because in addition to the desmosomes, the intercalated discs also contain gap junctions. And then these gap junctions allow cells to essentially speak to each other, to very, very easily pass ions from one cell to the next. That allows the pump to work as a coordinated unit, not as a very uncoordinated kind of multi-unit thing. Even though the heart is a double pump, the pumps work together to get blood from the systemic circuit, pump it to the pulmonary circuit, get it back from the pulmonary circuit, and then pump it back again to the systemic circuit, and keep our blood flowing through our arteries and veins throughout our lives.